Thank you for joining this language telling you things. So what is, in Heideggerian thinking, we don't so much attempt to ask the question that Kant still asks, like how does language point to things, but we just assume language is sort of actually telling us things directly. Has Trump gone semi-hemi demi-hog or whole hog on this situation here? I could say sort of that in the Lotus Eaters episode where we get the semantic field of the word nous, N-O-O-S, but I think, so far as I could tell on initial search, but I haven't actually looked at the semantic field, all the examples, that nous and this word with N-O-U-S is basically the same thing, and the what we're meant to picture is waking up in the morning. This is nous. The nous of his Odysseus's followers is wiped away by the Lotus Eaters, and they can't find their way back to the ship. Odysseus says famously, they meant us no harm, but we cannot stay here. So this is the Western, what is the end of Russia's action? Has Trump gone whole hog or semi-demi, hemi-hog? These being difficult questions are still not without any possibility of answers, as they say. We have here a situation where Odysseus has maintained his nous, and then, therefore, if there's nous, then there's a possibility of Heimat in Hegel's sense. The absolute moment for Hegel means that the home for human beings has been established. The absolute moment. This is sort of the Lutheran sense of things. Hegel is very Lutheran, if you follow what Kierkegaard says. But in any case, in other words, Hegel says basically being out of tune with your homeland, with Heimat, is what constitutes the human being prior to the absolute moment. And Luther's saying sin is what constitutes the human being so long as we exist. Therefore, how does he say that? Leiden, Kreuz, that, the suffering. Nail yourself to the cross. Whereas in the Catholic version, there's the original sin, but it doesn't totally constitute man, and then there's some super added on this sort of possible three timelines, or say you had like three different X accounts, but some of them were like linked into like really hidden dark lists. You'd been listed on all the best stuff, and you're getting, some of your timelines were like way more rizzy than others or whatever. And the thing is, for the Catholics, it doesn't constitute the being we are, that we have original sin. It's a problem. It's a major part of our essence in a way, but it doesn't simply constitute the kind of being we are. But whereas for Luther and the Protestantism properly, not Protestantism as widely preached, there's an analysis of this in, where is it, in Heidegger's early work on Luther. For Luther, they get to something more like the Hegel situation. But so let's look at the current situation at the same time as we're trying to deepening our sort of attempt to ask, like, what ground did Heidegger reach? How far has he proceeded? How far has he smoothed the way? Can we follow this path? Is it a worthy path? As it were, just as a direct question. So Trump, the current Trump thing sort of is good for serving for a question if there's the extinction of Vernunft, of reason. So I remember, for instance, just to give some orientation here of like what the situation is as far as the history of ideas. There was a I think he's still alive, and he's a good scholar, Martin J., who studied people like Lukács and the Frankfurt School and sort of the people that took up the critical theory, the Kantian philosophy, by which no longer do we have only natural natural philosophies, which Newton's an example of natural philosopher, of course, and natural history. So it's somebody like Alexander von Humboldt, who proved that Hegel was wrong about alligators or something by actually going and doing historia, which means sort of investigation. It means something like what we sometimes use biology to mean. I've looked at a bunch of these books, by the way. Like years ago, I used to look at these natural history books, which they have a good collection of them in the Biosciences Library at UC Berkeley. I find a lot of there's a few things that I wish I had committed to memory that I'll never find again, that are quite interesting, because you see the sort of you see what happened through the fact that sort of amateurs went out and did natural history. Just like birders. I think birders still do this today. They describe what they see. They write in a paper, I saw this rare bird, this is what it looked like, here it's what it was doing. People write in and say things, and then you find out some funny stuff about like how they maybe learned how the locals had described things and then transformed it according to their oculari, or their observation. Ocular, I guess. Therefore showing sort of a difference between being involved in the in a way that's strange, because you could always say the tribal man, the ethnos, has his theories, but he doesn't spell them out to himself as theories. Just like you could say in a certain way the ancients were aware of progress, they just didn't think of it as progress so much. Or, they didn't bring it to the full point of theorizing it as Leibniz did with the theory of optimism, that the progress is possible and therefore will reach the Heimat, or the Nóos, as it were, the homecoming. And this thing, Vernunft, Martin J. says. So this is the anecdote I wanted to give, because it's sort of interesting. It's like he said, sort of like after 50 years of studying, he says, sort of casually in a lecture, well, I never really understood what these guys meant by Vernunft. I could never really get it. And I don't know if he means, so maybe he didn't know some technical issues, but he probably he did. But I think he means more like he couldn't really see it the way they saw it. There are technical issues like that. We could say Vernunft for Adorno Horkheimer and for Lukács, especially for Lukács. It's more tragic in his book on the destruction of Vernunft. You get this moment, so around 1950, remember, Stephen Cochrane tells us the communists were really communists. They held their theories to be true. So there was this moment where people were becoming aware of this same problem that Heidegger's in a more radical way bringing out in his critique of the Elven thesis of Karl Marx, which I think was just like a note. I don't think it was necessarily a developed thing that he had published on Feuerbach, basically criticizing him for not being materialist enough. We talked about this in a previous one. You get this situation where Lukács has to admit that because the ground of Marxism actually, why isn't it also a false consciousness? So there's this idea in Marxism that you can make a calculus and say the way most people think is a function of like what class they're in and like whether they're a worker or not, whether they're ripped up, torn up, lumpen proletariat, so-called, a man in rags, or whether, what their class history is and how they've been ideologized or put into false consciousness. But then they have to admit at length, how do they know that they were ever in the true consciousness? It's just a wager. That's the thing that starts to break down. And in 1950, Lukács has basically admitted this. But at the same time, like I just mentioned, de facto, there were really existing believers on communism in the Soviet Union, in that regime. So we have the question of Vernunft, and I tried to bring it into contact with Trump in the current moment. So we were just looking at the thing with Moyne and the end of the so-called the post-legitimacy period. So what's the post-legitimacy? There's a Vernunft way of doing things, and we'll call that the sort of substantively proper way of doing law. Often the conservatives give lip service to this. Oh, we're all for the strictures of this Vernunft system. They don't actually put it that way, but I'm just glossing it that way. What they say is when there's any question of public opinion or versus doing things correctly through the legal mechanisms, then we'll do them through the legal mechanisms, and plus all this type of thing that criminals often do. It's is it always, if you get a really corrupt person, what do? They swear down the line to be in favor of every normative thing that there is, strong on law and Dirty Harry and things have to be done the way they were done in the 50s or whatever, and I never even occurred to me not to dot a T, not to dot an I or cross a T or whatever, and math is and math and engineering are to be somehow genuflected towards with an almost irredeemably sort of incurable fashion, as though they were posing and becoming this sculpture of the perfection, and one could never. This is the kind of guys that could almost see somebody like Samuel L. Jackson taking to a T, whereas if you made a slight move to somebody like who's the other actor that sort of resembles Nelson Mandela a little bit? He was in it's Brian De Palma movie playing a judge. Morgan Freeman, sorry, very common actor. But I think if you think about Morgan Freeman and then you think about Samuel L. Jackson, you could see Samuel L. Jackson would be more the type to hectoringly play on having all the correct moral commitments, whereas you could see if it was Morgan Freeman, then there would be almost like a religious quality instead, rather than a hectoring and a brutal quality about it. You could almost, as it were, it wouldn't be a matter of a criminal just covering over their thing, but it would be a matter of true believers suddenly. But in any case, and this thing's put aside, we have the situation of Vernunft as the substantive law. So I'm trying to give the rough calculation for what the supposed legal regime of legitimacy was meant to be. It was some negotiation between doing things correctly according to the substantive law, or Vernunft, and the public opinion, how the hoi polloi, or how the mob thought, so that there was a sort of increasingly undermined situation where the justices were meant to represent an anti-majoritarian institution, and anti-majoritarianism was continually under greater and greater attack, so that eventually one just simply said, preservative of all other laws is the vote, and the vote is the voice of the people, and it control, and we don't, and constantly you have these little gestures of the political class to say, oh, but these are we're merely non-elected officials who've merely been appointed to office. We're ashamed to exist. So of course, naturally, the law has lost a lot of its vigor, but that's not the only reason. I think the larger reason is simply that there was general agreement on a lot of issues, and that the Potter Stewart, I know when I see it about the French film, The Lovers, that played in, I think, Ohio or some Midwestern state, where it was then challenged because the mores of the big cities were ready to screen that, but the mores of the other places weren't ready to see that. So that was one big reason. But why had the mores changed? It was for n number of so-called historical reasons. And then we have a question of whether we analyze things from the point of view of ourselves as historical beings. So again, natural history, looking at things as they straightforwardly present ourselves as historical factum, historical things coming to pass, assassination, or looking at them from the point of view of the natural philosophy, which would just tell you about sort of the way things moved or something. You couldn't actually know if Trump had gone whole hog, because you couldn't actually identify a being called a hog. You would instead identify some kind of, depending on which physics you're doing, there could be infinite number of physics, but depending on what kind of physics you're doing, you would describe it in those terms, the Newtonian terms, for instance, which are no longer chiefly the ones that matter, even though we're constantly told, well, if we describe them that way, we could get you to the moon with them, blah, blah, blah. But in any case, there's other things you might want to do that you couldn't do by describing it that way. So there's an infinite number of physics. I mean, that doesn't exactly prove what I said, but I mean, it's still the case. It depends what you want to do. You're going to develop different mechanisms, different way to describe motion. That's what physics does. History does something else. So that's what we're sort of trying to get into when we try to get to the ground of Heidegger, something where there's this discussion between Dilthey and Count Paul York, between the Nous school and von Ranke, between a bunch of different people, and they're breaking on these type of issues. And then these things come to power. But what is the gist of it in the center of the political movement? So we have right now, again, another part of the Hinckley lacrimae, or from here these laments or tears. The situation where Dershowitz has come out with, I think it's even a book or something. He's written like a small tract on saying, well, this language. So Bannon was big, heated on this and wants to get this done, the third term issue, and Dershowitz has come out with this argument as is sort of there's like a hidden, there's a hidden positive valence to being a little bit dirty for lawyers, and Trump has always been associated with the worst of these type of lawyers who push things, who play it like a game rather than paying any attention to the matter of Vernunft. And Dershowitz has said that the 22nd Amendment has clearly forbidden being elected to a third term, but not being selected for a third term or serving a third term. First and foremost, he says, being elected to the third term is forbidden, but not holding a third term is not clearly forbidden. So that's ambiguous, according to him. To say the truth, it's slightly ambiguous. I wouldn't say it's not ambiguous at all. But I'd say under normal circumstances, like for instance, with Harris, there was a theory on the natural-born citizen issue, which, although it had been worked in the lower courts, hadn't yet been settled by SCOTUS, which still could come up. I don't see why not, but there was never the will to really bring it up. It was mentioned in the article, and it was forgotten, just as, I think this is also, Ted Cruz is born in Canada or something, I don't know. There's some other natural-born citizens issues which has just been ignored. Bigger one, I think, was with that Vietnam vet who they were kept denouncing sort of mercilessly as a songbird, McCain, because I think he was born in Panama or something. He was a serviceman. There's all these versions of natural-born citizens arguments. Some of them have already been supposedly settled by the court, but I guess they could be somehow re-percolated or whatever. Some of them, I think, how the fruit tastes on them is going to be a function of how much will there is in the current White House to make them whole again, to resuscitate them. So Dershowitz come out with these arguments which he shows as mechanisms for Trump getting back in. And I'm going to say here, I guess I'll give this sort of avenue of invasion to gauging for yourself whether you think this is sort of how we could gauge. You have a lawyer, his business is to sell arguments, Roy Cohn, whoever, or to use all means possible, intimidate the opponent. And first I would say this is like the kind of thing sort of airheaded people do, is they just always rush out with whatever generic argument they can come up with, because they don't really care about getting to the truth. I think that's often a sort of thing. It's just like, it seems clever to be able to raise any objection, even though the objection doesn't really fit. But I think, let me try to show what Vernunft ought to mean as it's reaching towards Heimat. I'm not saying we should, I'm saying it just to understand it, just to see what it was saying. We probably can't adapt this straightforwardly, because once we see that being is not this just a waking up and then having the world their nous, that wakefulness, the coming awake, or like the examples I've been giving about Odysseus coming to Ithaca, not knowing he's in Ithaca, then Athena tells him something, then he realizes, oh, I'm already in Ithaca. This type of thing that's analogous to waking up in the morning is being as the Greeks thought of it. But Heidegger said we could also think about being through the Seinfrage and break into this and distance ourselves from this concept of being. And then we should come into a different situation. So the example I wanted to give is that on another issue, Dershowitz came out defending Netanyahu and Israel. This was some time ago. It wasn't the level of slaughter wasn't as great at that time, and it wasn't as clear at that time that just the extreme openness, about this this slaughter. There's still a few sort of people making apologies that put up Potemkin structures and try to say, oh no, they're not actually, even though, yes, some lady that, notice that we actually have officials that are investigating these things, they say. Notice, yes, it's true that there's some lady that was investigating these things and who observed rapes of the Palestinians while under detention, who reported it was then thrown in jail or something. But notice that we actually have these people looking into the wrongdoings, and then they're putting up more and more sort of Potemkin structures to hide how direct the will to inflict things that the Geneva Convention doesn't allow, right? But at that time, Dershowitz was defending the initial sort of reactions, I think, to the attacks on Israel. Made this, nonetheless, I thought it was still totally showed a fallacious argument that Israelis, and this argument is often mimicked by whole classes of people. They're having a discussion, friendly discussion. This is your talking point. Is there a moral equivalency between the outright killing of Israelis by terrorists and the Israeli Defense Forces methods of not directly targeting civilians, but nonetheless reliably and continuously slaughtering civilians? And this type of argument by confusing people by saying, oh no, they're not directly targeting the civilians, so then there can't be anything, there can't be any moral equivalency here. They can't be really like the terrorists that deliberately targeted civilians. So yes, it's true, we're killing actually 50-fold more civilians than they ever killed, but we weren't directly targeting them, and so on and so on. So I think this is obviously, this kind of legal dealing goes against Vernunft. That's what I'm trying to establish. So Dershowitz is capable of selling clever arguments, intellectual arguments that go against Vernunft, that go against reason or nous, that go against what the Heimat would look like. But then this question is, if we don't actually know, if we must admit that we don't actually know what Vernunft is, and even that we don't actually know that the human being is something equipped with this Vernunft, equipped with reason, then, the whole, then the Kafkian issue comes in, right? Then the question of whether there ever was a law, and then I guess I'll end it just by giving this image that to me is speaks volumes that Kafka produces of these in the trial and their process of these lawyers, to which he says actually they weren't even allowed to be in the law building. There was like no so it's sort of almost like we're in this Dershowitz zone. But what they would do is like there would be a bunch of them, and then like one or two of them would charge up, like what's that guy's name? Hermann von Winkelried or whatever, the guy, the Swiss spearman who lunged forward and allowed himself to be slaughtered in order to let the rest of his, after getting a promise that his family would be taken care of and all that, allowed them to gain the victory by everybody was focusing in on him. So then Kafka shows this notion of the lawyers are running up the steps of the courthouse, and some of them are being apprehended and not allowed in, and actually they didn't have any explicit right to be in the court, but if they would sort of like push the limits, as it were, and make it to the court, then and some of them were overwhelmed, stopping or arresting the motion of the ones trying to get to the court. They would this image is so unparalleled. I don't the whole tone in which it's shown. It would be silly in another author, but somehow Kafka manages to, I guess partially because he draws on this Goethean language, is always regarded as Olympian or whatever, the von Kleist and Goethe language, which is usually referred to as putting it in internalistic terms, like it's like there's something in Kafka that isn't just about the rise of liberalism and the liberal individual. No, it's about eternity. But okay, but we don't really know what the light of eternity is, and that's one of the big questions that all human beings are facing. I just make one statement, sort of a. I think it's good that all these things are coming into challenge, because it represents a chance to gain ground. You don't want to just, when you have something that's very weak structures that were only sort of functioning because of you had a click. I guess the question is, do you want something that's functioning only because you have a really tight-knit clique, and they shut out anything that doesn't agree with them? That's sort of like what things were before all the talk of nihilism came up. And then there was always and then beside from that there were, okay, I guess I have to say I'm a little bit unclear on these two functions. There's that, but that at the same time, aside from that, it seems like there's these totally intellectual questions, because there's a whole stream of questions raised by Descartes and by Kant and the schemata of the pure reason, and et cetera, that finally lead up to this question that makes me want to say probably Leo Strauss is incorrect if he says Heidegger is a historian or an existentialist, rather than a guy that backs natural law or Platonism. Natural law and Platonism aren't the same thing, but natural law comes in later, but it's sort of, they're connected. And historicism and existentialism aren't necessarily the same thing. They can be constructed in many different ways. Historicism can be more like, as we were saying, natural history, and looking at, but instead of looking at natural history, what Paul York is saying is we are our history. And I mean, instead of looking at the subject matter of birds or of trees or something, natural history describing things, we describe what happens in history in the same way. That's the science of history, which seems to be so totally in conflict with the description of reality we get from physics, which just gives us a matter of motion. Searle says, and I suppose in a way it's true, but it doesn't help at all, that they can be regarded as the same, because whatever happens, I don't think it's true, but I just can't state it correctly, or I just don't know how to state it neatly, that he says it's the same, but it's just physics is about the small things. I don't think that's right. I think in fact, it's a totally different way of doing things, and in a way, what Arendt and what Heidegger are saying is the way we do things in physics is secondary. You're already in history, you're already thinking of the natural history, investigation of your environment and so on. You're already looking around, and then also you learn in school, in a classroom, to become a physicist. It's a secondary thing somehow, I think, is what they're partially pointing at. That's not theoretically clear to me. It does seem to be the case empirically or by observation or test, but maybe it's not true. Okay, so we have a lot of issues smoldering in the cauldron, and don't let your eyes get plucked out by the Sandman, because it would take them up to the half moon and have his young that have little beaks eat them.